more time. So I shall recite a few lines from a particular poem, which poem I am coming to that after a while. I am the poet of famished days, a witness to daily nightmares of a clear reflection of death. My spring is spent in the long wait at the food queue. My sleepless nights hear the calls of the cautious siren. My goosebumps are raised by cruel, unreasonable bloodshed. My wonder is the cruel chain in my hands. Though the days are bloody, yet your firm creations I still establish in every corner of my mind. Hence, I too believe today, mere soft talks of peace would sound like futile comedy. Hence, I look around and see the conviction ready in every house for a struggle against the demons. These lines are a translation from a poet, from a poem by the poet Shukanta Bhattacharya called Rabindranath's Proti, or a poem dedicated to Rabindranath Tagore. And as many of us know, today is Rabindranath Tagore's birthday. So every other year there is a celebration of Rabindranath Tagore's birthday as a separate occasion. But when some of our friends are starving for 11 days, it's not really an occasion for a celebration. Rather, what we thought, that this is a time when we need to remember someone like Rabindranath Tagore, who was not only one of the most vehement critics of the kind of ultranationalism we see all around, and we had discussions on that in the lecture series on nationalism. Professor Ranbir Chakravarti had spoken on Rabindranath Tagore's views of nationalism, and also who was a great champion of humanity. And this is a time when our first priority should be a struggle for humanity. So rather than going for a separate cultural celebration of Tagore's birthday, we would like to invoke Rabindranath Tagore in solidarity with our movement, and to start that, we can have a discussion on how Tagore can be relevant to the present moment, or how do we relate to Tagore nowadays. For that discussion, we are fortunate to have two of our teachers with us, Professor Kunal Chakrabarti and Professor Ranbir Chakrabarti, both from the Center for Historical Studies in JNU. So I would request Professor Kunal Chakrabarti and Professor Ranbir Chakrabarti to please come here and join us. Yes, so thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. So, coming back to what I was talking about, when Professor Ranbir Chakravarti spoke on Rabindranath Tagore's nationalism in the Freedom Square during the nationalism lecture series, then we had a very interesting question. So we would like to start from there. That Rabindranath Tagore in Bengal is of course celebrated as a great cultural figure who is relevant to almost each and every aspect of Bengali life. But outside Bengal, how do we generally relate to Tagore? And my conversations with many of my non-Bengali friends led to a kind of unfairly generalized conclusion that there are two identities of Tagore which are most familiar to people beyond Bengal. One is a textbook version of the poem Where the Mind is Without Fear, which almost everyone read at some time. The other was that Tagore is the writer of our national anthem. And then there is what we can call a legend about the national anthem itself, that it was created in celebration of a British monarch, George V. Now, there was a question asked to Professor Chakravarti at that time, that whether actually Tagore was a pro-British person, or whether he had actually composed the national anthem in celebration of George V. So I would like to start with that question, because that day there was not ample time to get into this particular question, sir.
Good evening, namaskar to everyone. I feel very privileged to be part of this program, particularly considering the background, the very living moments of the movement and the need to think freely and openly, even when we have our dissenting positions. Now, regarding the national anthem, we often hear many statements that whether, and there are written pages in YouTube or this kind of internet resources that Tagore's Jana Gana Mana came in 1911 as a celebration of the George V's arrival in India. Now perhaps this is where two history teachers may come and throw in a little bit. The Delhi Darbar in honor of King Emperor George V was held on 12th of December 1911. And when Jana Gana Mana was composed by Tagore, 11th December at night 1911. Now the basic common sense that how in the Darbar to be held the next day, how the poet could compose something the night before in the hope of it being included in a highly structured sort of a state program. The very logic of this falls apart, particularly looking at the minute details of the chronology. The piece was composed originally as not as a song but as a poem of 5 stanzas. Interestingly, about a fortnight later, on 27 January, the 1911, the 20th session of Indian National Congress was held in Kolkata. And Tagore, already a formidable cultural figure and a major poet, by this time he was just 50 years of his age, he was asked to sing the inaugural song at the time of this program. For the first time he sang Jana Gana Mana. Next day, on 28th of January 1911, 2 English newspapers, one the Statesman, the other is the Englishman, reported that the Congress session was held and the well-known noted Bengali poet Rabindranath Tagore sang a song in praise of Emperor George V. If we look at the other newspapers, particularly Amrita Bazar Patrika on the same day, 28th of January 1911, recording and reporting the event the day before, they say very categorically the inaugural song was sung by Tagore, Jana Gana Mana, which was categorically stated as a devotional song, and then was recited a poem, Hamare Badshah, written and recited by a person called Rambhut Chaudhary. Now this is where the media comes. Even nowadays the role of the media we know. Sometimes the nefarious practices, which JNU was at the receiving end of this nefarious practices by certain section of the media, this is also a media creation. Amrita Bazar Patrika reported the exact sequence, and Englishman and the Statesman combined the two, created this effect which is now perpetuated. And very interestingly, the poem appeared in 1912, February, 2 months later, in the organ of the Brahma Samaj as a religious poem in the Tattvabodhini Patrika. Nothing to do with nationalism. It was a much later understanding that Jana Gana could come as a national anthem of India in preference to Vande Mataram. There was nothing of it that the poem was created in order to shower a praise and eulogy on George V, and then Tagore wrote numerous letters, particularly in 1933, 2 letters, I'm not getting into the details, where he said it is sheer stupidity on the part of his countrymen to imagine that he could compose a laudatory song or a poem in praise of not only George V, but any George. That was exactly the language. I think we can move on to other things, and there is absolutely nothing in an iota of truth in this kind of disinformation, misinformation. Unfortunately, even those who are close to the corridors of power are raising this, flogging a dead horse for their nefarious tendencies.
Thank you, sir. And we have already had a lot of discussion about Tagore's views on nationalism, and it is quite well known that he was not at least a nationalist in the sense some people claim themselves to be nationalists nowadays. So if we leave that out and look at some other aspects, and I would go to Professor Kunal Chakrabarti about this, that another major question which concerns us is the social role or the position of a university. What does a university mean? What is the autonomy of a university? And for whose sake is a university? Whether it's a crime to speak out your view inside a university campus, who is an insider in a university and who is an outsider, all these questions are quite pertinent to us. And as we know, Tagore was not only a literary figure, he was a very active person and a very prominent social activist of his time. And his name is very closely associated with one particular university, which is known as Vishwabharati in Shantiniketan. So, if we have to look back at Tagore, how he approached the question of the university and what was Vishwabharati in the days of Tagore, I would like to ask Professor Kunal Chakravarti about.
It's well known that Tagore didn't like the formal educational system that was available to Indian students during the colonial period. He himself didn't attend schools. I mean, he tried to and went to one or two schools, but he couldn't adjust himself and dropped out very early. So whatever education that he received was entirely on his own and at home. Therefore, from the very beginning, he was critical of the kind of educational system that was offered to Indian students. And therefore, when he was in his late 30s, he began to contemplate that he will have a school away from Calcutta in what he thought was the bosom of nature, because his father had bought some land in Bolpur, which is now called Shantiniketan, the nest of peace, and he thought that he will start a small residential school there, where the normal disciplines of school education wouldn't apply. The curriculum would be extremely liberal. They will have a liberal dose of literature and the arts of all kinds. You know, visual arts, the singing and dancing, everything. And therefore, this will be a kind of an open school where both the teachers will have to be trained to train the students in this particular manner. So Tagore began to collect a handful of committed people around him, and thereafter started this Brahmacharya school in Shantiniketan. The school grew into a large institution and eventually became a college in 1922 and finally into an university. Now, I didn't go into the details of the evolution of the school. The important fact is he wanted it to be able to generate and offer liberal education to all who were interested in it. And he actually made it open to everybody. A residential school which was open to both boys and girls at the same time, who would be taught together, was unthinkable in those days. And it's very, very interesting and goes to show the kind of credibility that Tagore had actually acquired by that time, that Bengali middle-class parents sent their daughters to this institution to be trained by Tagore, and where boys and girls would study together, and they will learn to paint, to draw, to sing, learn literature, and learn the traditional arts. They will do the maths, and they will do all other important things. But the fundamentally important thing was that it should be close to the environment, right? There would be no classrooms. the classes were held under large trees, in the shadows of the large trees, and so on. And this idea that this is a place where an international community of scholars will come and ideas will converge, right? And that's why he called it Vishwavarati, where the entire world meets, right? That was the idea with which he began, and during his lifetime, he was entirely successful. It produced some very eminent literatures of Bengal. It produced some of the best musicians and painters of Bengal. The Bengal School and the follow-up of the Bengal School was actually Bengal School of Painting, of Art, was done in Vishwavarati. After the demise of Tagore, the central government eventually took over the university and then introduced the usual curriculum of all other central universities, not one at a time, but gradually. And the result of that was that finally the university became more or less undistinguishable from the other universities of its kind, but it's still one of the best centers of art, and particularly painting and sculpture, and of music.
Sir, I would like to take this opportunity from Kunal on Vishwavarati, because I started my teaching career in Vishwavarati as a lecturer in the ancient history department, and there I could feel the pulse even in 1980s. I'll tell 2 or 3 scenarios, not of my time. What Kunal very rightly pointed out, apart from the formal classes, there was the overall thrust on creative impulses of students in the midst of nature, and the importance of the art school, Kala Bhavan, where in 1920s came a very, very major figure of Indian art studies, Stella Kramrisch, who at that time, as a Jew in Europe, was unable to have any safe life. And Tagore knew her. She met Tagore in England, and Tagore immediately invited her to come to his institution. Stella Kramrisch is known as a great historian of Indian classical art, particularly sculpture, and also what he called the Hindu temples. But what Stella Kramrisch taught under the instruction of Tagore in Vishwavarati Kala Bhavan, 2 of her greatest pupils were Ramkinkar Bej, one of the greatest artists and sculptors of post-independence India, and the blind artist Vinod Bihari Mukherjee. They inform us that the classes began to be taken by Stella Kramrisch was not that of the Indian tradition, for which there was the great master Nandalal Bose. Already under him the training had begun. Stella Kramrisch began to instruct them in the latest current world art movement, like Impressionism, Surrealism, particularly the European take on the latest art movement, and Vinod Bihari Mukherjee reminiscence, that the entire new windows after windows opened before us, and we are taken to other planes than merely nationalistic, revivalistic form of painting that was very much a part of the Bengal school. So that was one. And the other important moment is in a memoir of a person called Sujit Kumar Mukherjee, a very close associate of Tagore, originally a pupil of Tagore, a major figure, now completely forgotten, a linguist, an expert in classical Chinese, Tibetan and Sanskrit. He remembers, and in his published memoir, an incident of 1932 when Mahatma Ji in September was on his fast, and Tagore was extremely anxious about Mahatma Ji's health and deteriorating situation. On that occasion, there were other compositions in support of Mahatma Ji's fasting. But then Sujit Kumar Mukherjee, one of the leading student figures in Vishwavarati, and he was always against a complete non-conformist, recalls two positions. They said, first of all, Vishwavarati in those days had common kitchen, everyone ate together, no caste differentiation anywhere in the eating habits in the tables. And then they demanded to Tagore that this is not enough. In the common kitchen of Vishwavarati, at least during this time, the food is to be prepared and served by the Bhangis, none else. And Tagore immediately conceded to that, agreed to that proposal, and that was done even when some of Tagore's closest associates were quite orthodox Brahmanas like Vidushekar Shastri, a very erudite scholar, but he too even accepted the food prepared and served by the Bhangis employed in the area. And this was something which was a common feature in 1930s in Vishwavarati, and Tagore had full support to these programs.
I will just add one thing. I'd just like to add one thing. Mahatma Gandhi actually said that the students should clean their own toilets. They shouldn't employ anyone to clean their toilets, and Tagore actually started the practice. However, after a time this was discontinued, but even today, in honor of the first visit of Mahatma Gandhi to Vishwavarati, that day all latrines are cleaned by the students of Vishwavarati themselves.
10th of March.
It is 10th of March, yes.
Okay, so thank you, sir. And just before going into the next question, I must assure everyone present here that we know there is a shortage of time, and we promise that no one is going to miss their dinner because of us, because I'll just come back to the discussion with two other questions, and then there is a very short cultural program which will not take more than 15-20 minutes. So nobody should worry about missing the dinner because of us. But before, though we know there is a shortage of time, before we conclude, there is one pertinent question which I would like to ask to both of you. That as we started, there is a problem in connectivity, because most of Tagore's creations are in Bengali language, but his range of creation is diverse, and there are various kinds of creations. So apart from his poetry, which was necessarily in Bengali and whose translations are not very good, if we look at other forms of Tagore's creativity, particularly if we look at Tagore's painting, which is neutral of language, and as we know, Tagore's name is very closely associated with the nationalistic movement behind the Bengal School of Art. But if we look at Tagore's own painting, he was not anyway belonging to the style of the Bengal school, but it was a completely different type of painting of his own, maybe a bit influenced by the expressionist painting of the West. But so I would ask both of you about Tagore's painting and Tagore's music, if that can help us in connecting with Tagore in a better manner.
Before I go into the question of Tagore's paintings, which was a major preoccupation of Tagore's the last 15 years of his life, that's also an interesting thing. Tagore started doing his paintings since the 1924-25, the last 15 years of his life, the late 60s and the 70s. Anyway, but before that, let me share with you a problem that I often have while reading literature of other languages into English. You see, most of the European literature we read in English, and we are in a position to appreciate them. I, however, believe that translations, particularly of creative literature, and most importantly poetry, can be done effectively only among cognate languages. One can actually effectively translate English poems into French, and from French into German, and so on. But English poetry into Chinese and French poetry into Bengali is almost impossible. And therefore, when I hear grumblings about Tagore's translations are not particularly adequate, and that Tagore doesn't come out to be a very major poet from the translations that are available, I grudgingly agree with that assessment, because I'll share with you a moment of misgiving that I have with regard to translation. Some years ago, I picked up in a bookshop a selection of the poems of the great Urdu poet and revolutionary thinker Faiz Ahmed Faiz, and it was translated by his most well-known translator, Victor Kiernan. I flipped through the pages of the book for about an hour and a half with the idea that I'll eventually buy the book and read it at my leisure. And only I discovered that I see a very ordinary poet in the translations. I knew that this assessment of mine was wrong. I must accept the assessment of those who have assessed Faiz in the original. And they think that he is a great poet, and I must accept that, and not through my very inadequate familiarity with Faiz through translation should be my opinion of him. Similarly, I make the same plea for Tagore, and not just Tagore, all such poets and writers who have the problem of coming across into another language. Now, however, there are two things about Tagore. Apart from his prodigious literary output, there are two other things of Tagore which marked fundamentally his creative output. One was his music, and he was taken up with it from his very early adolescence. And the other was his paintings, which he started doing from his mid-60s. Let me spend a few moments on his paintings, and I'll leave the music part to Ranbir. You see, Tagore had no formal training in painting, ever. Formal or informal, no kind of training ever. And therefore, he was always suspicious of his capabilities as a painter, always wrote letters to his friends saying that I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm being compelled to do it, that's why I'm doing it. He said, untutored fingers and untrained mind. Both are correct in the formal sense of the term. Now, between 1924 and 1941, about a period of 16-17 years, he produced about 2,500 paintings, drawings, doodles, etc. Now, the paintings actually began with his doodles on his manuscript. He would cut out words and replace them with other words and so on, as all creative writers would be doing, as we do when we write our trifling essays. But therefore, he felt that the page looked awkward. And the first statement that he made about his art, that was for exhibition in 1931 in Paris, in 1927 in Paris, he said that these scratched out lines cried out like sinners to him, and he had to do something about them. He had to give symmetry and harmony to these lines, and therefore he began joining them and making fine, fantastic abstract shapes out of them. That became the stuff of his paintings that he did later, and once he had written to his friend Elmhurst that he doesn't know what he is doing, but he's in the throes of a cult of paintings, right, which are the product of an excess of dream energy. And it was actually a dream world that the twilight world of his paintings exhibit, completely unconnected with his literary outputs. He is known as a romantic lyrical poet, and that romanticism has very little to do with his paintings. As a matter of fact, he was exposed to the very best in both Indian art as well as Western art. Many of you may not be aware that in 1922, he actually invited the Bauhaus in Germany to create an exhibition of the leading contemporary European painters in Calcutta, which had happened, and where the paintings of Paul Klee and Vasily Kandinsky were actually exhibited back in 1922. So he was familiar with all that. But the paintings that he created were completely unique and original. It had absolutely no connection with either the traditional Indian painting, be it the Ajanta kind of frescoes, be it the miniature standards, both Mughal as well as Rajput and Kangra. He was actually witnessing the Bengal school happening at his home under the leadership of his nephew, later, that Western Expressionism possibly has a parallel in the output of Tagore, but it wasn't actually that. I will also share something else with you. His colors are extremely grim. He played with black, and while in tempera and gouache, it's predominantly white, which is mixed with other primary colors, in order that if alterations have to be made, this could be done, because that makes the colors opaque immediately. However, he played with black, and he mixed black with all other colors, making it dark, gloomy, and the effect chiaroscuro. He would allow black to run on a wet paper surface and then give shapes around that. It's an extremely, all painters have, those whom I know personally, told me that it's extremely difficult a color to work with, and yet he did so. There's a school of thought which says, cannot be verified any longer, that Tagore was partially colorblind, that he couldn't see some of the colors, and one of the colors that he possibly couldn't see was red. That would astound anyone who looks at Tagore's paintings, because he had made wonderful use, right, stark use of scarlet and various hues of the scarlet, right? I mean, one doesn't know. One thinks of Beethoven, when he produced the Ninth Symphony, he was completely deaf, and therefore he created the music in his head. Similarly, of course, he was imagining a color which he couldn't see on the paper, and he was using it so effectively. One can actually go on speaking about him. But I would invite you, those of you who have difficulty accessing Tagore's literature, to look at his paintings, because you wouldn't require any empathy for any knowledge of Bengali culture, which so informs his literary outputs, and even his musical outputs, but definitely literary outputs. Therefore, I would suggest that this is a language that he created, which was entirely original and unique. It did not ask you to be aware of the cultural context in which it was produced, and try and see whether you can relate to it. Thank you, sir.
Only a few, one or two sentences to continue with Kunal's very clear introduction to the complexities of Tagore's painting. One is astounded to find that Tagore, largely known as a fascinating music composer, from the age of 11, 12, 14, he began to compose his music, and perhaps about total of 2,214 songs are attributed to him. That was for about 60, 70 years of his active creative life, while just in 10, 12 years of his life, 2,500 paintings came up, almost like the lava of the Vesuvius, like that. He couldn't just control himself of the urge to paint. And with that, I must once again point out, nothing of nationalism in this kind of a painting, nothing of the upholding of the typical Indianness in his painting. His countrymen completely misunderstood. Tagore was very upset and wrote letters after letters. मैं कभी ये पेंटिंग को इंडिया में नहीं दिखाऊंगा. Let it go to abroad. I'll never show it in India. It was so disgusting. Luckily for some of his close aides, friends, and his sons, those paintings were brought back to India, and now at least we begin to know what kind of innovative spirit, far beyond the tradition of Indianness, he was trying to create completely on his own. And Kunal was telling very rightly the problem of understanding of the translation of Tagore, whether in his poetry, particularly in his songs. One major point, particularly in the songs, is the problem of translation of pronouns and verbs. It is peculiar in Bangla that the pronoun and the kriyapad are not gender specific. In Hindi you will always say, wo aati hai. Immediately you know it's a woman is coming. Or wo chala gaya. This a man has gone. In Bangla there is no such gender specificity in the language, in the pronouns and the verb forms. And Tagore deliberately used this very deliberately to go beyond the gender differentiation in the theme of his songs and his poems, deliberately making it gender neuter. I'll give you, and only in little hints sometimes he would leave in his songs. I'll particularly mention here a song which most of the Bengalis may know, and this is Summertime. It's a song starting with, I'll just give a very poor Hindi translation. It starts with like that, Chokke amar Trishna, Trishna amar bokkho jude, that mere aankh mein pyas, mera dil mein pyas, and I am like Ami Brishti Bihin Boishakhi Din, almost I am the parched day of the month of Vaishak. It goes on like that. And this is taken mostly people by seasonal song to be sung in the celebration of different seasons, starting with in the month of Vaishak for the song of summer. Tagore's song for nature, Tagore's song celebrating environment changes and the seasonal changes is remarkable. I'm not getting into that. Now, there is a line in that song telling that in the terrible storm that broke out, jhad utheche, tufan aa gaya, and then comes a line, a hint of it, Abagunthan jai je ude, my veil has gone out, ghungat chala gaya. Now, who has a ghungat? So, the I is not a man, it is the story of a woman. And then to put it in the sense that woman says, I am a parched, dry day of Vaishak, the whole song is that of celebration of the desire, physical desire of a woman. No Indian poet in 1930s had perhaps this kind of a courage to put it in the celebration of the physical desire of a man, of a woman, and this was actually put in the mouth of Chandalika, the Chandala girl who becomes the heroine of the famous Tagore dance drama Chandalika, based on a Buddhist Jataka's tale. And this was the transformation in the new form of the art he created at the very fag end of his life, dance drama, where it is the dances are the form of the drama played by men and women, particularly Vishwavarti mixed students, in front in open public. In those days, performance by women on public stage is something decried. It's only the Baijis, they perform openly. Tagore once again with a single stroke broke this taboo and brought girl students on the public stage playing side by side with the male students. And in the very last stage of his life, 4 such dance dramas came out. Chandalika celebrating about a Chandala girl. Before that, Notir Puja about a Noti or a courtesan, once again based on a Buddhist story. And then on the basis of Shama Jataka, the story of Shama, once again. All these 3 dance dramas center around the women figure, not anything to do with the Buddha himself or any of the disciples of the Buddha, and the agency of the characters actually are held by women. They do not have to be educated, taught, or sort of given preaching by some male members of the Buddhist order, though the storyline is taken from the Buddhist tales. This is something he was doing in the very last phase of his life, and we know many of his short stories. This is another form Tagore was trying right from late 19th century, 1884, the first of his short stories. And from then onwards, the remarkable voice of women that came out, one after the very famous story, now available in English translation, Punishment. Particularly of a low caste woman, wrongly sent to the gallows to keep the honor, family honor of 2 brothers in the family. Remarkable story. And similarly, the wife's letter, Stri Patra, where a married woman leaves the household just as a voices a protest and cannot take anymore the domesticated position of woman in the within the confines of marriage. This kind of stories are abound and particularly gains relevance in today's this seeking of azadi, not merely from politics, but from every sphere of life, as Tagore repeatedly said, that what is called Parivar Tantra, freedom is required. How much freedom is given in the management of family to the women and also even the children? This question he was raising at the very late 19th century after he visited for the first time England and brought out this essay that whose family, whose order and whose kind of discipline is being imposed and to be respected. I think if there are other questions.
No, sir, we have already exceeded 30 minutes. So thank you very much to both of you for sharing these thoughts with us. And